Hi everyone, thanks for joining. And I want to start by thanking the organizers of this fantastic conference, Unconference, Pop-Up City Extravaganza. Woo! Yes. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share what we've been creating. And I want to start by asking this question. How can a decentralized autonomous organization calculate the fair value of diverse contributions? Because if we can solve this problem, then the community could collectively decide the value of all of the contributions that they've already completed. And then when a new contribution comes into the space, they could also decide what that value is, directly reward the person, and there'd be no need for a middleman to decide what things are worth or to take a cut of the money or the value. And this problem is something that I've been trying to solve in academia for the last 6 years or so. My background, my first degree was in design studies, my second was in psychology, and my third, was a PhD in neuroscience. And during that PhD, I became completely disillusioned with the academic system because, as I'm sure many of you know, it's not entirely optimized to find the truth at some times. And I started to move into what's known as openscience. And so for those that don't know, this is the subset of academia that's trying to create a completely free, transparent, scientific system for the world's people. And I also started to transition into metascience, which is the use of science to optimize the scientific system itself. And so my first project was an attempt to motivate people to adopt the many platforms that already existed. This is an open source platform called Free Our Knowledge, and basically we organize collective action campaigns to motivate people to move from the existing journal system and unhealthy practices towards open science journals and other reproducible research practices. And I campaigned in this space for a few years and I learned a lot. And one of the biggest learnings was that I do believe that collective action can help motivate change, but in academia, it's so risk averse that the rate of change that we would see with this kind of strategy would be decades. And I personally feel that we have incredibly important problems to solve now, or ideally 10 or 20 years ago. And so I started to rethink my assumption that we already had all of the technology and the models that we needed, and I went back to the drawing board, so to speak. And with going back to the drawing board, I embedded all of my learnings in campaigning in that space. And I'd say the one main thing that I learned, the biggest learning, was that we really need to directly reward reviews. Because there are already countless platforms out there that let you review preprints, give them scores on multiple dimensions. But the problem is no one's actually using them. And the reason is there's no direct incentive to do that, where there's plenty of incentives to continue publishing and reviewing for the existing journal hierarchy. And so I took that main concept and I adapted an existing model that was already in the literature. And that model asks people, it basically allows a space where the crowd could rate a paper, for example, on multiple dimensions of interest. And then that could be an information source that the community could filter in the way that they want. And so I adapted that model and added this extra component, which is the idea of meta review. So this would just be some validated meta reviewer in the community who could provide a rating for reviews themselves. And the idea there was that this would incentivize people to produce high-quality reviews for the community. Now, there is a recursion problem there because you start to wonder who's going to review the reviewer, who's reviewing the reviewers, and so on, and you kind of just end up in this never-ending spiral. But I still felt like this model had enough premise to try and test out in the real world and see if it actually had any legs. And so I started designing some experiments to validate this concept. I started reaching out to colleagues, I started pitching it at conferences, and I fairly quickly came to the conclusion that academia is actually not a very safe space to prototype these fairly radical ideas. And so after my PhD, I decided to leave academia. I started to self-fund myself by playing poker, and we formed a new community that was based on Burning Man principles, because I'd recently discovered a local burn, and I found it to be a really creative, free space where you could explore and experiment with minimal risk. And so for the last few years, our community, which is called Open Heart and Mind, has been hosting a range of diverse, gift-based gatherings, which are like Burning Man, but more diverse. So they also include science and well-being and culture. And we've been using these as an opportunity to test this model that I was developing for academia in a real-world context. And we've played with a few different models, and reached one that I believe is now very generalizable, and it could apply to many different communities, including this one. And as a first test case of that idea, I took some of our data to a recent openscience and metascience conference called AIMOS, and we've just collected data that is applying the same framework to that conference. So in that case, we were rating the contributions to the conference itself. And so I want to take you through some of the main learnings that we've had over the last few years where we've been prototyping in the real world. And I think it's relevant because some of these models speak to some of the models that already exist in the crypto space. So the first model that we tested was just gratitude tokens, and we basically give everybody some number of tokens based on how long they were at the gathering for. And we gave them a list of 57 contributions and just said, hand them out in any way that you want. And so there are protocols out there that are similar to this kind of idea. And what we found, not surprisingly, is this is an incredibly biased way to do things. Because someone actually gave me something like 98% of their tokens, which clearly is not a fair representation of the value that we all collectively created to create this experience. And from the feedback, we also realized it's not a very inclusive process, because on average it took 30 to 40 minutes for someone to complete this entire review. And it also requires a high degree of knowledge of the entire contribution set to do this task well. And so because we're looking for a process that everyone can be involved in, and we can allow everyone to have their say, we moved on to another model. And with the second model, it was more like the academic journal model I presented before, and we were really trying to fix this problem of bias. And we did that by offering people a rubric. So now it's kind of like an assignment score sheet, where you've got some number of dimensions and some number of scores, and each cell has a description of what that score would look like. And so people gave ratings on multiple dimensions for the offerings to this festival. And what we found out of this process is that it is definitely less biased than the first version. So having that rubric and that description for what each score should be worth really helps people. And we also know that from the literature. That's nothing new. We also found that it, again, wasn't very inclusive, because to give an absolute score like this, you still need to understand the overall space of contributions and how everything really fits together, and also takes quite a high degree of time. And probably the biggest learning really was that it doesn't allow for diverse contributions, because if you add a new contribution into the contribution set that's of a different type, you now need to create a new rubric to represent that kind of contribution. So this model is relatively accurate, but not inclusive to the crowd. And so this then brought us to the third main model that we tested. We tested more than this. And so this is a pairwise comparisons model. And this is basically where you give someone 2 contributions and ask them to tell you which is more X, where X is each dimension of interest. And what we know from the literature and also our experiments is that this is a really inclusive protocol, because it takes maybe a minute or 2 for someone to do one of these pairwise comparisons. And it doesn't take a lot of cognitive load. I actually use these in my experiments, and we also find that when people have a subjective bias, they might not even be aware of it, but this type of paradigm can bring that subjective bias out and make it explicit. And the key benefit of this is that it's really inclusive to diverse contribution types. So you no longer need to make any top-down decisions about what type of contribution something is. You can just give someone 2 contributions and ask them to tell you which they're more grateful for, and they can do that regardless of whatever the contribution is. And so pairwise comparisons is nothing new. I'm sure many of you have used them in different contexts, but the really key innovation that we're doing in our model is also recognizing that these pairwise comparisons can also act as the baseline unit of contribution to the community. So I'll break that down for you. I'm sure everyone here knows what a bit is. It's a 1 or a 0, and you can think of that as the smallest unit of digital information. Well, if you think about what you're doing when you do one of these pairwise comparisons, you're also adding a bit of information in relative information space. So you're basically saying, out of these 2 contributions, give one of them a 1 and give one of them a 0. And what that means is that this is the smallest unit of relative valuation that you can ever use to find the relative valuation of things. And that's really important, because we can then treat it as the baseline unit in our system and use it to peg the value of every other contribution to the community. So I'll show you in a minute how we do that on the next slide, but the point I want to make here is that this model is not antagonistic to other review models. Even the previous models that I just showed where we're handing out gratitude tokens, those too could be considered contributions. The review itself could be given some score in the number of relative equivalent pairwise comparisons. And then the second main point I want to emphasize here is that because we now have an immediate reward that we can give someone, then we can create a direct incentive for people to do this task. So what it means is if someone's sitting there and clicking buttons, doing these comparisons, we can reward them with 1 unit of value every time they do that, and then they're getting their little dopamine hit, they're feeling like they're being rewarded, and they can just keep on playing the game to maximize their points. So, the framework is called Wisdom, and that's based on the premise that we're building something that's more than just an information system because we're embedding our values into the code from the outset. And so there's 6 main stages. I'll take you through them now. The first is for the community to record contributions. It's really up to the community to decide what they think a contribution is. In our context of the festivals, we've been reviewing things like DJ sets, art installations, food that people made, and so on. In academia, you could be reviewing code, paper, data, etc. For ZuBerlin, we could be reviewing setting up this space, all of the people that gave talks, and so on. And so it's also up to the community to decide what kind of values they want to embed into the system, and they do this by choosing some number of dimensions. So at OM, we've been exploring a range of different dimensions. Probably the most stable one that's evolved out of the data is gratitude. And so for the sake of comparison, we would suggest that other communities could also adopt this common dimension of gratitude, because that means that we can talk the same language. But beyond that first dimension, the community could literally decide whatever values are important to them and embed them into the code from the outset. And so then, like I said, these reviews are completed as these pairwise comparisons. In this case here, we've asked someone to compare this DJ set to this art installation. And as I said, every time someone does one of these contributions, they get rewarded with 1 unit of value. And so to use that as the basis of this entire system, we use what's known as a meta review. So here we're giving someone a regular contribution, in this case a DJ set, and asking them to compare that to some number of reviews. And because we can vary the number of reviews, then you might get to a point where you're asking someone to compare 400 of these button clicks to the energy or their gratitude for that DJ set. And at some point, someone might start saying, yeah, I'm more grateful for those reviews because they know that that takes a lot of time to do. And so by collecting a range of these meta review data, we can then fit a function that allows us to interpolate a relative value for every single contribution to the community. And what's important to note is that at no point here has anyone made top-down decisions about what something's worth. No one has given a score for particular contributions, and everyone has had an opportunity, if they want to log on and click a few buttons in the space of waiting for the bus to arrive. And so this then, the next stage is recognize, and this is really the key output of this entire model. If you forget everything else, just remember this part. Because what we end up with here is a multidimensional representation of the unique qualities of every contribution that we've logged in this system. And so here you can see that at OM, for this particular gathering, we measured gratitude, uniqueness, alignment with the OM vision, and diversity and inclusion. But of course, this could be whatever contributions, whatever dimensions make sense for the community based on the contributions that they're analyzing and their particular chosen values. And I guess another point that I want to highlight here is that this is now a transparent information set that the community can filter in any way that is useful to them. So people could actually create algorithms and filter information, finding exactly what they want to find out. But we can also train really powerful algorithms on this data that are now aligned with our values that we've embedded into the code. And we can do other really cool stuff. So I think already at the recognize stage, we've got an incentive for people to start contributing to the community. But if we want to make it more explicit, we could also create a token system. So at OM, we've been exploring the idea of a concept token known as an omnom, which is a direct mapping of the gratitude dimension. And what that means is that these tokens, which currently are just numbers in a spreadsheet, but these tokens would represent the collective gratitude of the community for someone's contributions. And the idea is that the community can use this information in any way that they want. If they wanted to subtract, say, a conference fee, then you could end up with a balance that shows those people that have given more than they took to the event, and they might then have a surplus of tokens that they can pay forward to other people, creating the beginnings of a circular gifting economy. And so we can also filter the data over time, looking at reputation profiles. So here I'm showing the data filtered by the DJ tag, but it could basically be filtered in any way you want to tag your data. And what this shows then is the percentage of value that you've added to the community over time. And of course, there's more complex ways that we could do this. Because we have a transparent data set from the outset, it's all just a click of a button, or really the writing of an algorithm to find a new metric that is useful to you in your community. And then, of course, the question comes up, well, what's stopping people gaming the system? Well, from the outset, everything's transparent. I think I forgot to mention this is all based on open science principles of transparency, replicability, and so on. And so you can analyze all of the data, and you would be able to look at the review data, particularly the meta-review data, and create algorithms that pick out those cases that show when someone's trying to cheat the system or they're acting in overly biased ways. And they might be biased because they don't even realize it. We know lots of people have implicit bias, so we could have psychological training where people learn about their biases and become more self-aware. Or in those cases where it's quite obvious that someone's trying to cheat us, we could now count up the value that it has cost the community to correct that problem and hand that person a bill so that they can potentially make amends if they want to play with us again. And so what you end up with out of this entire process is a transparent template that shows the complete set of contributions to the community, along with the valuations of those contributions by the same community. And this then creates a direct incentive for people to get involved throughout the life cycle of the project, giving in the ways that they want to, and trusting that they'll be rewarded fairly based on the past data that they can see. And of course, the idea is that this can handle, I think, literally any type of contribution, and money is a very important contribution. And so if money was one of the contributions that came into the community, we would now have data that we could use to automatically distribute that money throughout the community to those people who have provided value. And so I don't know how I'm going for time. I've got some data for TinyOM. Have I got any questions at this point? Yes?
Two questions. So as the team is building this, to what extent are you using the system to evaluate yourself as you're building the system? Like what are the limits of it from using the thing to do the thing? And then what are your like aesthetics or metaphysics on like quantity versus quality? Like where does one begin and where should the other end in all of this?
Great questions. So I'll try and repeat the questions. So the first one is about to what extent are we actually using this as we build it? Where we're at is we've prototyped and we've collected 2.5 years worth of contributions as best we could. But the prototype is a spreadsheet. There's only so much we can do with that. And so we've only really used it for fixed contexts like the gathering that I'm showing you here. The goal is once we can scale up and ideally find some developers that will help us do that and or funders, then we can start to back rate all of the contributions that we've kept a record of. And so yeah, the idea is that we'll be dog fooding as we go and we'll be using the learnings as we evolve this system to improve and optimize over time. And the second question was about quality versus quantity. Thank you, great question. I think of this as a kind of combination of qualitative and quantitative data because we have numbers, sure, but those numbers are tied to values that are important to the people. So I see this as kind of a meshing and merging of those two concepts, and I don't know that there's a clear delineation because it really comes down to how you define the dimensions that you measure, how many dimensions you measure, and so on. Does that answer your question?
It does, but I am interested in discussing that one more with you later.
Cool, happy to. Any other quick questions? Thank you, yeah. So about the use cases, I'm a bit insane. I feel like this could be used for anything, but it is intentionally very simple and flexible for that purpose. And it's kind of happenstance how I left academia to prototype in a safer space, but in doing so and moving to that festival space, it really forced it to become diverse and inclusive because it wasn't before, and the model was incredibly, restrictive and only capable of being done by people that have a very technical knowledge or are comfortable with numbers and scoring and that sort of thing. And so moving to this really simple model, I think it could be applied to all kinds of different scenarios. And you mentioned an example of, making food and living together. Keen to explore use cases. So what we've been doing is just planting seeds in little communities, and I have a slide on this later. I'll show you the seeds that we've been planting. But it's still very early days, and looking for communities that are interested in this idea and would like to explore use cases, because I think it could be, what we've been prototyping with is fixed events, because it's a relatively fixed container, and it makes it easier to figure out what are the inputs to that experience. But this could also evolve into an ongoing reputation system for a community that's continuously providing and exchanging value. What's the time check? How long have I got? 3 minutes. Did we start? Is that based on starting on time or? Okay. Cool, no worries. All right, so I'll skip through the Tanium data. I just want to highlight this. So this is a data set that we've just collected. So this is from an openscience and metascience conference called AIMOS, and this was hosted in November of last year, and it was 82 people came together in an unconference style with talks, workshops, hackathons, and so on. And we posted a form afterwards where people could nominate contributions, and they could also select values that they wanted to see embedded into the prototype. And from the 55 that were nominated, we selected 24. This is basically because you get combinatorial explosion. And the way we match pairs is it's a fully balanced design. And so with too many contributions, given our limited technology, it starts to explode in how many pairs you have to do. And so we selected a representative sample. What you can see here, just to kind of clarify, I don't know if there was confusion before, but the blue dots are the meta reviews. And so the blue line is the function that we fit, and then each of these red dots is one of the actual contributions to the conference. And so what I've plotted here then is the dimensions that we measured. So for this prototype, the AIMOS community were interested in gratitude, generosity, inclusivity, transparency, integrity, and creativity. And you can see now that we have like a really diverse sample that shows the unique qualities of all these different contributions. And something I really want to highlight is that this type of framework, I think, this speaks to the question before. It is really inclusive to diverse contribution types that you wouldn't normally even hear about. And so some of the things that were nominated were really background tasks, like someone who went to the conference venue, did a dry run of all the systems and Zoom and that sort of thing. And also this one, which is pretty random, but I love, because it was someone who made a really big effort during discussion breakouts to attend the group which had the lowest turnout, regardless of their interests. And that's plotted here in green, and it's a tiny, tiny recognition. So the crowd, didn't give that a huge amount of recognition, but that might mean something to that person, to know that they were seen and really appreciated for that effort that they took. And so I think this is an example of the way that this could apply to a whole wide range of different use cases and really start to bring to light those contributions that might otherwise be missed and not recognized. What else we got? Okay, so this is really just speaking to the way that this could spread throughout society in a fractal manner. At OM, we're going to continue prototyping and sharing everything we develop as we go. And the idea is that we'll hone in on our particular use cases over time, but those use cases won't particularly suit every community that might adopt this. And so we've started prototyping with AIMOS. Viberclips is a gathering I attended and presented a workshop in America, and that's also prompted a new collaboration. And just last week, and also later tonight, I'll be presenting at SIPS, which is another open science conference, starting a new prototype there. And so as this potentially spreads throughout different sectors of society, those communities would now have a way to share their data with one another. And if they do so, then they could also express gratitude at the collective level or other values that they are aligned with those communities. And so the potential is for Wisdom to connect diverse communities through this new common language of digitally encoded values. And as it does, it can potentially empower communities to learn about themselves through self-reflection and meta-research as they conduct science on the data that they collect. And I think the real key take-home is that this model can directly incentivize valuable contributions at every level of the life cycle of the project, because it rewards those individual reviews that people can make, but it can also really reward high-level stuff like evolving the actual system and the framework itself. And I guess the way I see this evolving eventually potentially could become some kind of a decentralized network where the communities themselves are generating the information, but we could then train the kinds of federated AI networks that we've heard about the last couple of days on these communities' data. And because that data would then have our values embedded into the code from the outset, I believe this could go some way towards solving the alignment problem we see in AI. And so yeah, with that, I want to thank all of my amazing collaborators who have helped bring this vision alive the last couple of years, as well as my collaborators in the AIMOS collaboration, Brooke for kickstarting the Vibe Camp collaboration, my as unknown contributors to the Zips prototype. And yeah, this is an open invitation to the ZuBerlin community. If you're interested in these ideas, then I'd happily develop a prototype with anyone who's interested. And so I've popped up a little QR code there. There's a survey I've created. If you're interested, you can use that survey to nominate contributions. This can be literally anything that you've experienced during the last 2 weeks that you've appreciated. And you can also give us consent for us to review your contributions, like the talks that you've given and so on. And you can also tell us what values you think should be embedded into this system. And I'll leave it off there, and thank you very much.